Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone and welcome people, unknown numbers of people on Zoom. It's my great pleasure to introduce Sherecce Fields today. This is a bit of a homecoming for Sherecce, who is a North Carolina native from Kinston, North Carolina, and was an undergrad here at Duke. So we are delighted to have her back in this capacity. She was a psychology major, although at the time we did not have a neuroscience major, and I wonder if she would have been a neuroscience major. She did work with Cindy Kuhn and others on biological science, so she's a biologically oriented psychologist, but she always had clinical interests. And so she left to go to graduate school in clinical psychology, moved to a number of different locations for different aspects of training, and then ended up at Texas A&M. I would say as a UT Austin grad, I'm disappointed. But nevertheless, she started there as assistant professor and rose rapidly through the ranks to just now full professor as of this year, so congratulations on that. Throughout that, maybe one of the first talk you've given as a full professor. That's awesome. So I followed her work for a long time because of really a unique combination of things. She is a clinical psychologist. She is interested in how to change behavior, but she adopts a very cognitive perspective on it. So she has worked on issues related to delayed discounting for the last decade, so we connected some time ago. And she applies ideas from behavioral economics and other aspects of behavioral sciences to problems out there in the world. So I think you'll see today that her work really spans going from laboratory to intervention. The other thing that's really notable about her, she has sort of the curse of competence. She just gets asked over and over to take leadership positions. So at A&M, she's been associate chair for a while. She's thankfully, as she mentioned this morning, stepping away from that for a little bit. It's a very large and complicated department, and she's been a leader for a number of years. She also has been leading some interinstitutional collaborations and a lot of other things. So in addition to all the research we're talking about today, she's also a wonderful servant to our university and to her profession. So I'm delighted to bring her back to Duke. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Sherecce.
Oh, thank you so much for that introduction. I sound kind of awesome, but I don't know if I'm that awesome. So I guess I will say I'm totally going to use notes. This is my first talk in like 2 years in actual person, so please forgive me. But I'm really excited to be here. I'm also a hand talker, so this mic thing might move. So I apologize if I get quiet and loud, but I'll work on it. So I'm going to talk today about some research that has spanned since postdoc to now on delayed discounting as a trans disease process in health behavior. Let's see. Okay, so I'll start by talking just very briefly about health risk behaviors and why I do this research primarily in adolescents and emerging adults. And then I'll talk about trans disease, trans diagnostic processes, and why delayed discounting is actually a pretty important candidate for those types of processes. Then I'll talk about some original basic studies looking at delayed discounting and smoking and eating behavior. And then transition to some of more recent work looking at delayed discounting and associations with other health risk and mental health issues. And then super excited about this new intervention that I developed with my colleague, Rachel Smallman, who's a social psychologist. And it's a counterfactual based intervention for lifestyle behavior. And then lastly, just some future directions that we hope to go. Okay, so first, this is just a graphic of the preventable causes of death in the United States. As you can see here, smoking accounts for about 18% of the deaths in the US. Overweight and obesity is not far behind, and sometimes they flip-flop depending on the year. And overweight obesity is a little fuzzy because it's associated with so many other things. So things like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. And then alcohol is number 3, and it doesn't seem to be as bad, but it's still not good. And so I'm going to focus on these top 3 in my talk today. All of these, though, I will say first emerge and peak during adolescence and emerging adulthood. Okay. So examining all of these health risk behaviors, you might think to yourself, there may be some underlying factors that are common across these. And this is why we study these trans disease processes. So the traditional way that people have examined disease is that each disease has its own etiology. So it's led to increased specialization. So you kind of focus really in depth on your one area of study without really branching out and looking at how these different mechanisms might work in other areas. And so this leads to these scientific silos. So decreased knowledge of other diseases and decreased translation of findings from one disease to another. So this is why we study trans disease processes. And so what we know is that symptoms of disorders can be heterogeneous. So they may overlap, they may have some commonality underlying these processes. And the study of trans disease processes actually help us understand these processes that might work in multiple diseases. So you can identify something that occurs in one disease, and then it advances science because you can then apply what you learned to something else that has a common process. And so some benefits of this is that it's transdisciplinary. So you have people who work together in biology and social science and engineering perhaps. And they help you to provide an understanding for these causal processes that underlie these different diseases. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it kind of leads to more rapid dissemination of the work, which is great. Okay, so delay discounting refers to the preference for smaller immediate versus larger delayed rewards. And delay discounting is a really promising factor for a trans disease process in that it's been associated with so many things. So in a recent meta-analysis, it's found that greater discounting has been associated with, major depressive disorders, schizophrenia, borderline, et cetera. And I hope to impress on you today, actually, that more recent research, some in my lab, some in others, has shown that delay discounting is also associated with a number of health behaviors. Okay, so this is a screenshot of a delay discounting task. And so what happens for most of these tasks is that you're asked to pick what you prefer. So you can choose something that is more recent. So for example, $6.50 now, or you can choose something that is delayed. And so $10, 365 days from now. Now, depending on the task, the amount of the value of the money may be larger or smaller. For us, we choose smaller amounts because we work primarily, again, with adolescents. And so kind of the $1,000 5 years from now is hard to interpret. And so we stick with smaller amounts and smaller delays. But most tasks look similar to this. For most of the early work that I did, we also said that it's really important what they chose because they were going to get what they chose, right? So we actually gave them whichever option they chose. So if they chose the $10, 365 days from now, we literally mailed them $10 a year from the date that they came to the lab. More recent work with COVID, we've put a lot of online studies, and so we don't actually do that anymore. But there's a lot of research out there that suggests that even if it's hypothetical, you still get the same results. Okay, so from the choices that they make on the previous task, we plot a curve of their indifference points. So the indifference points is the smallest amount that they're willing to take versus the longer term delay. So for example, that person on the very left would choose to take $8 one day from now compared to $8 today compared to $10 one day from now. And then the person on the very far right would take 50 cents today compared to $10, 365 days from now. And so once we have plotted their indifference points, we're able to use this formula on the left to calculate the area under the curve. And so we use this as a rate of discounting. The smaller the area under the curve, the more impulsive they are. We and others have also used what's called the K value, and this is kind of the rate of decrease of the slope of that curve. But this assumes that there's a hyperbolic shape to the curve, and so we really prefer to use the area under the curve because it doesn't assume any kind of theoretical assumption about what the shape of the curve should look like. Okay, So much of my research is focused on adolescents and emerging adults. And this is because adolescence is characterized by these developmental changes, and the timing and the onset of these changes really rely on a lot of things like culture, nutrition even, things like that. And there are a lot of theories about what these changes are and how they take place. But kind of common among these theories is that there's a kind of impulsive emotional system that develops and is solidified in adolescence. And then there's a more cognitive decision-making system that takes a little longer to develop. So one of my favorite analogies about this is that they liken the adolescent brain to a car with a fully developed gas pedal and weak brakes. So they're really excited about things that bring reward or avoiding things that cause pain, but they don't have necessarily the cognitive ability to kind of regulate those processes. Okay, so that leads me to talk a little bit about some initial research with smoking. So again, smoking, approximately half who smoke are expected to die from smoking-related illnesses. And as many as 60 to 70% of adolescents who smoke regularly continue smoking into adulthood. However, a lot of these adolescents report that they actually want to quit smoking. So 65% will say, I know I'm a smoker, but I really don't want to be. And as many as 60% of adolescent regular smokers report trying to quit. So there's really a kind of a disconnect between the fact that these adolescents are smoking, but they don't necessarily really want to. And so it makes it a really great target for prevention and intervention. Okay, so our first study, in order to better understand these developmental changes, we included a group of adolescents who are experimenting with smoking. And so for experimenting, we operationalized this as having tried cigarettes in the 30 days before the study. And this study involved a community sample of adolescent smokers, experimenters, and non-smokers. As you can see here, the groups are pretty similar across. However, we did verify smoking status using cotinine content, which is a nicotine metabolite. And as you can see here, our experimenters look very much like our non-smokers in that they don't smoke enough to have a high enough cotinine content, and our smokers definitely do. And then we also found differences in IQ, in that our smokers have a significantly lower IQ than our non-smokers, and the experimenters actually look quite similar to the smokers in IQ level. This is something that's actually been found pretty consistent in the literature about smokers and non-smokers. We're still not exactly sure why that's the case, but we did control for it in the analysis. And interestingly enough, so some of my early work is about kind of families and family influence. So I always try to throw in some parent measures here and there if I can. And what we found actually is that, so for smokers, they are much more likely to also have a parent who is a smoker, which is not surprising. So what we have here, you can see on the left is value in dollars, and then across the x-axis is delay in days. And you can see here that our experimenters actually are very much like our smokers in how they discount. And there's a significant difference between the experimenters and the smokers and the non-smokers in how they discount. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, although cross-sectional, these results would suggest that delayed discounting may predate initiation of cigarette smoking, and therefore may be an important risk factor for smoking later on. And even though we control for IQ, it still remains significant. Okay, so not only were we interested in smoking initiation and prevention, we are also interested in understanding the role of delayed discounting and treatment outcomes for smoking cessation. So we assessed discounting for program attendance, for reduction or cessation, and also follow-up patterns of smoking. And we wanted to examine treatments that were already happening. So we chose the not on tobacco treatment, which was from the American Lung Association. And this program consists of kind of 10 weekly sessions for adolescent males and females. And these groups were separated by sex because adolescents report different reasons for why they smoke. And so we really wanted to address that individually in their groups. And so approximately 20% of teens who do this program will actually quit, which doesn't seem like a lot, but for adolescent smokers, it's actually pretty good. So it's not a bad program. So for this program, we did 2 weeks of pre-treatment assessments, 10 weeks of our not intervention, 2 weeks post-intervention, and then we had follow-ups at 12 and 24 weeks. Okay, so for pre-treatment assessments, we did IQ, parental smoking, delay discounting, and then also a measure of sustained attention. So I'm kind of an impulsivity researcher, so I studied delay discounting, but then also some other aspects of impulsivity. And so for this study, we also included this measure from the CPT. So for you clinicians, you'll know what that is. For non-clinicians, you might not. And essentially, it's just like these white letters that flash on a black background, and then you press a button every time you see the letter X. And so we collect a measure of omissions. So every time that they're supposed to click the button, but then they don't, so they miss it. And then we also grouped everyone based on outcomes. So for reducers, these were folks who decreased smoking by at least 50% from pre to post-treatment. Our non-reducers completed the program, but they didn't reduce as at the 50% level. And then our dropouts did not complete the program, so they attended 5 or less sessions. So again, we had roughly equal numbers in each group. They didn't really differ on much of the demographic factors. However, which is interesting, the folks who dropped out were also more likely to have parents who smoked. This is actually a pretty novel finding. And so it'd be interesting to see, maybe there are some factors like family-based interventions that you could do for folks who have parents who smoke. So we were interested in determining whether our measures of impulsivity distinguish between these groups. And sadly for me, delay discounting did not. So again, these are all smokers. So my guess is, they probably discount at similar rates across the groups. And it did not predict those who maintained treatment or reduced their smoking. However, sustained attention did. So we have number of omissions on the y-axis, group status on the x, and our reducers had fewer numbers of omissions compared to other groups, which makes sense, actually. The better able that you are to attend to the intervention, to hold those goals in mind, maybe the better able you are to actually make reductions and kind of keep it going. Okay, so overall, delay discounting appears to be associated with the initiation of smoking. However, it may or may not be related to treatment outcomes, but the treatment type may actually matter, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And the ability to sustain attention may be a behavioral style that's associated with treatment success, but we need to explore this a little bit more. And our non-reducers and our dropouts did not differ. So we wanted to take what we learned from smoking and kind of apply those same things to eating behavior and obesity. So between 40 and 60% of children and adolescents in the US are considered overweight or obese. And there have been associations found between pediatric obesity and things like cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes later in life. And up to 80% of adolescents who are overweight or obese will become obese adults, which is pretty striking number. So when I was doing actually the treatment study for smoking, I found that most of the individuals who had a lot of trouble in that program were the ones who were also obese. So these are individuals who are more likely to drop out of treatment, both for weight management and for smoking. And they're least likely to make significant weight losses in weight management programs. One hypothesized mechanism is that, there's this common underlying delay discounting factor that's, between these groups. Or perhaps there's an interaction between weight and smoking status. And so what we did is we took a group of healthy weight and obese smokers, and, we did what we do. So examine delay discounting in the groups. We did have a sex difference in our groups. And then we also had a slight difference in age and in cotinine content. So our obese smokers smoked at a greater level than the healthy weight smokers. And so what we found is that our obese smokers, individuals who are overweight or obese, discounted significantly more than the normal weight smokers. And so to extend these findings, we actually did this in a non-smoking population. We found, some differences in income here. But what was really striking is that we did find differences between our groups here in non-smokers. So our obese adolescents discounted significantly more than our healthy weight adolescents, but the obese and overweight adolescents were very similar to each other in how they discounted, which kind of mimics what we saw with the smoking and experimenters and smokers. So it could be a developmental trajectory, again, in that, discounting leads to, improper eating and less exercise, and over time can progress through overweight to obesity. So moving forward, our lab at Texas A&M has examined associations between discounting and a number of other things. So we've looked at not only smoking and eating behavior, obesity, but we've also found these differences for alcohol use, for pain, for stress, sexual risk behavior, disordered eating and weight concern. And interestingly enough, we're interested in finding out what are some of these mechanisms that might support why this is the case. And so I will tell a little story. So I started at Texas A&M in 2010, and I started at the same time as my colleague, Rachel Smallman, who is a social psychologist. Rachel studies counterfactual thinking. And this is kind of the shoulda, coulda, wouldas of life. If only I had not done this thing, then this, thing would not have occurred. And so in talking about what each of us do, we're thinking, there's this thing about discounting in that you have to really think about your future behavior and the future goal that you want and reach for that goal while ignoring the need for immediate gratification, right? And so counterfactual thinking may be something that helps you do this. And so we did just a basic study to look at associations between counterfactual thinking and delayed discounting. And we found actually that those who were very impulsive discounters actually did not counterfactually think about their goals in the same way as those who were not discounters. And so we were like, oh, that's really cool. Let's do something about that. So, what we also find in the literature, which I found completely striking, is that counterfactual thinking is also associated with some of these same things. So it's associated with alcohol use, pain, stress, disordered eating, sexual risk, et cetera. So maybe there's some common mechanisms between the two that might be related to some of these health risk behaviors. Okay, so we decided we would try to develop an intervention. But first, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about counterfactual thinking. So counterfactual thoughts in particular are mental representations of alternatives to past events, actions, and states. So they focus on, what might have been and contrast reality with actual reality. So they are this if only then thoughts, could have, should have been, or what might have been thoughts. And they can be seen actually in a variety of places. So they show up in commercials, like I could have had a V8. They show up in healthcare, like if only I had gotten my vaccine, or if only I had, taken that, drug, et cetera. So most of the initial research on counterfactuals has shown kind of the negative consequences of counterfactuals. So, being associated with increased rumination and things like that for depression. However, this is the basis of functional counterfactual thinking, is that these actually could be really useful processes. So they can be useful and beneficial as self-regulatory strategies when they prepare us for the future and help us impact future behavior. So counterfactuals can strengthen causal linkages and behavioral intentions. They can increase persistence and personal control, and can help improve future outcomes. So not all counterfactuals, obviously, are functional. And so for these types of counterfactuals, it depends on the motivation. So if a person has a self-improvement motivation, then they'll do these types. So upward, additive, internal, and detailed. If they have a self-protective motivation, then they'll do these kinds. And they actually will make you feel better, but they don't function in service of improving a goal. Okay. So bringing this back to our counterfactual intervention, the key here is to harness those improvement components of a counterfactual and make it so they are easily translatable to a prevention plan. And so if we think about this in the context of like alcohol use, for example, we want to make sure that the counterfactual identifies an accurate antecedent or cause. So for example, going to a party, passing out after excessive drinking, that the cause can be acted upon by the individual, that it facilitates means or motivation to alter the behavior, and that there's a future relevant opportunity identified. So, for example, if we have a negative event that I went to the party and I passed out after drinking, there's a causal antecedent that's identified. So I identify that the problem here is excessive drinking. Generate a counterfactual. So if I had paid attention to how much I was drinking, then I would not have passed out at this party. And then there's behavioral intention and motivational change that occurs. And then you have this future situation. So I will make sure to look at the amount of drinks I have in the future. Okay. So why would counterfactual thinking actually be an effective health behavior intervention? So again, as I mentioned before, it's a successful self-regulation strategy. It increases all the things as clinicians that we really want to increase. So intentions, motivation, control, self-efficacy. They also function in service of a goal. So these are typically activated when a goal is thwarted or progress is stalled. Unfortunately, it doesn't matter what that goal is. So it could be a good goal or a bad goal. And so we want to make sure that we're using these appropriately. But they really work well for health behaviors in that, there's clear strategies and a clear goal that we want to meet. And it strengthens these causal linkages, but it requires accurate causality. So again, these are ideal for chronic illnesses and that there, are definitely specific goals we want to meet and specific strategies that we can use to attain those goals. And then lastly, which is really cool for kind of these just-in-time interventions, is that they're personalized and adaptable. So based on their person's own personal negative experiences, and they can be updated as life situations change. So really adaptable. Okay, so what we wanted to do was develop and try out this intervention in a health population. So we chose alcohol in collaboration with our faculty member, Dr. Rob Smith-Dvorak at University of Central Florida, who's an alcohol researcher. And we wanted to look at problematic alcohol use in college students. So college students consume alcohol at much higher rates than their non-college peers. They have significant drinking consequences that range from things like just missing class or being hungover while taking a test to things that are way more severe, like driving under the influence, potential sexual assault, and even death from alcohol poisoning. So most previous interventions to address this have used personal normative feedback, so kind of comparing yourself to norms of others who are drinking, but there are some issues with personal normative feedback, and what we wanted to do is, kind of leverage these counterfactual thoughts and use them in conjunction with some ways to maybe reduce some of the negative consequences of drinking in this population. So we used our counterfactual intervention in conjunction with protective behavioral strategies. So these are harm reduction behaviors that you can use while engaging in risky activities, and they help reduce some of the risky outcomes that come from engaging in these activities. And so alcohol-specific protective behavioral strategies fall into 3 categories. So there's manner of drinking strategies, and these strategies modify the impact of alcohol on the individual. So things like avoiding hard liquor or shots, eating before going out drinking, et cetera. There's stopping and or limiting strategies that involve reducing the amount of actual alcohol consumed. And then there are some serious harm reduction strategies that reduce some of the more harmful behaviors that might result. So maybe getting a designated driver or making sure that you watch your drink when you're at the bar. So several studies have used protective behavioral strategies as intervention, but we were hoping that with the counterfactual intervention, that they can reflect on ways that alcohol has personally affected them, and then develop some concrete ways to then change that behavior in the future. Okay, so this is our study. This was done in the psychology subject pool. Participants were excluded if they reported abstaining from alcohol. They completed assessments of like demographics, alcohol use and consequences, protective behavioral strategies, and then a bunch of other things not listed here. And they were followed for the next 5 weeks, in which we collected data on protective behavioral strategy use, alcohol use, and alcohol consequences. So all participants were asked to think of a recent time where their drinking has led to a negative, disappointing outcome. So they were asked to take a few minutes to write about that situation. And then for the folks in the negative event only condition, that's all they did. So they just wrote about the negative event. For the folks in the negative event with counterfactual intervention, they were asked to generate 3 if-then statements about the situation. They were also shown a list of these protective behavioral strategies, and we were told them, you know, sometimes it's really hard to come up with ways that this could have been different. You can use these strategies to help you generate your counterfactuals. And for example, we had a person come up with, if only I had drank some water, then I wouldn't have thrown up. And so then negative events with event description was counted to control for the more processing that happened in the counterfactual, and they were just asked to list 3 facts about the event. So we also did what we're calling a counterfactual transference task. And so this is kind of based on functional flexibility, in that to be functional, counterfactuals have to translate into some sort of prevention plan. And so participants identified a future situation where they could use this, a possible obstacle of doing the behavior, and then how they might overcome that obstacle. So for example, we have, if only I had eaten dinner before drinking, the future situation would be tomorrow when I am going to go drinking with my friends, the future obstacle, maybe I don't have enough time to get something to eat before I go. And then a future behavior that could overcome that obstacle would be taking a snack and eating it in the car on the way. Okay. So only the folks in the counterfactual condition completed this task. So we first examined the effects of the intervention on PBS use, controlling for sex and history of alcohol use pathology from the audit. We regressed mean PBS use from drinking weeks across the entire study onto counterfactual condition, negative event with detailed description, gender, and audit scores. And consistent with expectations, there was a significant effect of the counterfactual condition, relative control on mean protective behavioral strategy use, and a modest but not significant effect of the negative event with description on protective behavioral strategies. I know this is a very busy slide, but we specified a structural equation model, and in any given week, individuals' protective behavioral strategy use did not predict alcohol use or alcohol problems. This may be due to a granularity issue with assessing this at the week instead of the day level. We're not sure. However, weekly alcohol use was positively associated with weekly alcohol-related problems. At the between subject level, the effect of counterfactuals resulted in greater protective behavioral strategy use across the entire study. There were no effects across time, so this is kind of a broad effect. More protective behavioral strategy use resulted in lower consumption and fewer problems. More broadly, the effect of engaging in if-then thinking had the effect of reduced alcohol use and fewer alcohol problems. And it's worth noting that these indirect effects are pretty modest, so it might be worth exploring aspects that may increase these effects in the future. So here we have the effects on delayed discounting. We did a multi-level regression looking at protective behavioral strategy use on drinking nights with condition, sex, and delayed discounting as predictors. So there was a significant condition by sex by delayed discounting interaction, which seems really kind of counterintuitive, actually. We would think that delayed discounting maybe should be positively associated with protective behavioral strategy use. So more future thinking about consequences lead to more behaviors to prevent them, maybe, which is the case actually in both the control and negative event only groups, but this is all only for men. So if you receive the counterfactual intervention, it essentially removed the effect of delayed discounting. So perhaps engaging in counterfactual thinking takes protective behavioral strategy use off of autopilot. And so you actually focus on using the behaviors. But again, only for men. And it didn't really matter for women at all. And so one other potential explanation is that maybe counterfactual thinking changes delay discounting so that this pre-intervention delay discounting is no longer predictive. However, we don't know that. So we did not collect delay discounting over time, but we are doing that in a study right now. Okay. So trans disease processes offer a theoretical framework for generating novel interventions that we can use to test different experimental designs. Delay discounting is definitely a risk factor for a lot of health risk behaviors. And so, doing these kind of basic studies on delay discounting can help us identify areas that we may intervene. And really novel stuff that we're working on is that training intervention individuals to use these functional types of counterfactuals may be an effective strategy to improve discounting and potentially health risk behavior. They're effective in increasing use of protective behavioral strategies, and they have an indirect effect on alcohol use and related problems. Okay. So some future directions that we're hoping to go in are to compare counterfactual interventions to this gold standard PNF intervention for alcohol. We also want to automate it in a smartphone sort of app so that people, can generate these counterfactuals, they type them in, and then maybe they're fed back to them in situations where they might be at risk for doing the behaviors. We're also interested in comparing counterfactual interventions to MCII and exploring differences in diversity. So one thing that we actually have found in some of our research is that these interventions have differential effects depending on ethnicity. So we found that they're actually much more powerful in Hispanic, Latinx populations than in, Caucasian white populations. We still don't know why. Part of the thing we were thinking of is that perhaps these are individuals who start out with lower kind of perceived behavioral control over their health. And so the counterfactual interventions may actually help them feel more control over what they're doing. And we've actually seen that looking at perceived behavioral control, the counterfactual intervention increases it much more in Hispanic, Latinx populations than not. So another future area of research. And then also comparing new applications for this CF intervention. So as part of this Paths Up Engineering Research Center, we're doing a pilot study looking at eating behavior in individuals with type 2 diabetes. So we're having them wear continuous glucose monitors, take food photographs. We give them a report that shows what food they ate and their subsequent glucose response. And then we're having them generate counterfactuals about how they might have changed that meal to make it better. And we're interested in potentially other health behaviors, maybe some educational interventions, and maybe some mental health interventions for things like depression or social anxiety. And then lastly, just some other interventions for delayed discounting in particular. So we've done some research on contingency management. And so if you remember for the Not on Tobacco program, there was not much difference in delayed discounting in those groups, but we did find differences in delayed discounting predicting outcomes for contingency management. So that's another area that we might look at. We're also doing a pilot study looking at mindfulness-based recovery enhancement in individuals with opioid use disorder in the jails to see if, one, we can get movement on delayed discounting, but then also can we get them to not relapse once they leave the justice system. And then just some other things like maybe combining our intervention with positive normative feedback, or looking at differences or combining with episodic future thinking, which others have shown to be really effective in moving delayed discounting. That's it. So I wanted to thank our research lab, so both former and current students, and then also my collaborators kind of across the country for all their help. And thank you all again for having me here. So. Oh, that was fast.
Let me suggest that if you have questions, raise your hand, use the mic, those who want to hear. So questions for Dr. Fields?
First of all, thank you. This is really impressive work. So many interesting areas. What is an adolescent's understanding of what delayed discounting is and why it matters?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good, I don't think I've ever asked an adolescent what they think about delayed discounting. I think that might be a really interesting study to do. And I've not ever seen anybody else ask them either. I know typically they come in, they're asked to do the task, and I don't think it's ever explained to them what it's for or why. So that could be really cool to do. Yeah.
What is your understanding of an adolescent's understanding?
So my understanding of their understanding would be that they don't understand at all. So most likely, they're really just thinking about their day-to-day. They're really focused on what's going on right now and not really thinking so much about the future at all. We see this actually in some smoking outcomes, like when you talk to adolescents about down the road, you might die of cancer, or you might die of this other thing. And they're like, I'm not even thinking about that. But if you talk to them about more immediate consequences, your teeth are going to be stained, or you're going to smell really bad like smoke, and nobody's going to want to ask you for a date or things like that, they're much more receptive to that sort of feedback about smoking. So I don't know that they think about it.
Hi, thank you for this talk. My question is really along those lines of thinking about how far in advance do we think that adolescents can really jack themselves? So, for example, in some of these long-term health consequences, like smoking or obesity, those things are insidious and they take a long time before we really can see the effects of them.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have a sense of what those consequences mean to adolescents now, since those things do take a while to emerge?
Right. So I think they don't really think about it. And if you ask them to think about it, it still doesn't really affect them really. They can't really process that long term. Or maybe they just don't want to. But I think, what was I going to say? What was the second part of your question? I'm sorry. I had an answer and then I lost it.
I was just curious, do we think that adolescents can think about those things in the future when they're right now?
Mm-hmm.
I guess the other part why I'm thinking about this is the counterfactual situation. Those examples are about the next time I go out drinking, this is really immediate.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of translate these day-to-day behaviors to something that's going to turn into consequence 10 years from now.
Right, yeah. And so I think, that's kind of the beauty of the counterfactual intervention is that it really does focus on, kind of whatever negative consequence has happened for that particular person at that time. So they can think about how can I change this? And my hope is that it has cumulative effects so that, over time they end up not getting heart disease or not getting diabetes, just by making these small individual changes.
First, I'd like to say thank you. It was a great talk. I kind of have two questions. The first one is, what is your thought about making a study where you look at something longitudinal, like, you said that the car doesn't develop the brains until after maturity. So looking at the same exact people to see if this is something that changes or if it's something that's going to be intrinsic to that person regardless of the time that passes.
We haven't, but that's so cool. Do you want to come do that study? That would be really neat. Yeah, we have not done that. And honestly, again, I don't think I've seen in the literature where people have kind of followed people to see what their discounting looks like over time. But that would be a really fun one to do.
My second question is more specifically on the obesity one, just because you kind of brought the SES into the and my understanding of the research is that SES is a really big indicator of health outcomes of obesity. And what your thoughts are on that as a compounding variable of obesity.
Yeah, so I agree with you. SES is a big factor, and potentially, not just SES, but also food insecurity. And so we're actually writing up a study right now where we looked at associations between food insecurity and delayed discounting. And we find actually that folks who come from more food insecure environments do discount more. And my guess is because they're really just focused on I have to get my meal, like whatever that is right now when I can. And they're not really thinking about health goals, just being able to eat in the first place. And so it'd be interesting actually to do, I've seen actually in North Carolina, they do this, which is really cool, where they actually do food as a prescription, food is medicine. And so, being able to give people a prescription for fresh vegetables and food, and then seeing if that actually changes their discounting over time might be really fun.
Money might be like a sensitive thing for older adolescents and adults, but not so much in understanding in earlier adolescents, particularly when the discounting is sort of far out. Has there been any sort of testing for the late discounting test with something other than money as a substance? And how can we sort of think about that in relation to sort of age effects?
Yeah, so there are other types of discounting tasks. So there's a cigarette task, right? So would you rather have 2 cigarettes now versus 5 cigarettes later, or the opposite? And then there's also a sexual discounting task. So this one is more based on time. So how long are you willing to wait before you use a condom? And they look at that, looking at people you would most likely to have sex with and people you least likely to have sex with. And they've shown actually that, for people that you find really attractive, you're willing to wait a lot less time in order to use a condom before you have sex. I haven't seen, so that study was done in adolescents in my lab. We're writing it up. But there's, I haven't seen the tobacco one, and there's also eating one that asks about willingness to wait for really yummy food. But I haven't seen those ones done in adolescents. But my guess is that they'd be pretty robust because they don't focus on this abstract money thing. They focus on something really concrete.
I guess this is more of a comment than a question, but with that whole kind of longitudinal effect of the latest counting, it makes me curious about kind of that positivity effect theory with aging and how with older adults, there's this theory that kind of they're near the end of their lives, and they kind of focus more on present pleasure, satisfaction. They're like kind of close around them, and they're less focused on those long-term goals. Where younger adults are more focused on those long-term goals, and because of that, they'll kind of sacrifice any more present that they have. So it just makes you wonder if there might be that like U-shaped effect of like there's a middle age where you're really good at it, but then as you get older, it's like the breaks again, and you're kind of back into square one. So I was curious if you've ever, I don't know, investigated that kind of age interaction.
No, but okay, in this fabulous longitudinal study that we're going to design, we're going to look at this from children through adolescents, emerging adults, middle adulthood, and then aging. And it would be really cool to see. My guess is like middle adulthood, like you have other responsibilities too. So you really do have to focus more on like, you know, future, like your kids' future and that sort of thing. And so perhaps you're right, like you get very good at discounting at some point, and then it kind of goes all out the window. You're like, okay, I'm done with that. Like now it's back to just me. But I don't know for sure.
Hello? Is that the best we're getting? Okay. So I wanted to follow up on the attention effects and how they compare to the delay discount effects. This is sort of coupled with the question of what any of us understand when we're presented with a delay discount. But so the sustained attention predicted reductions in smoking. And so do you think that this is actually about the success of incorporating intervention or the power of smoking for people with intentional impairment? Right? So that you know that nicotine is like beneficial for attention. So do you think that this, which way is the causality here, I guess is the question.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say. Kind of just off the cuff thought is that for these individuals, if they're actually quitting, then maybe the effects of like tobacco on attention might be going away. But then it's hard. Yeah, I don't know.
Right, whether this is reinforcement, right?
Right.
That the people with lower attention are getting more reinforcement from the nicotine, and so then it's harder for them to quit because of the cognitive benefits.
Right.
So I think what's really interesting is the dissociation between delay discounting as a predictor and the sustained attention as a predictor, and the fact that you have the discounting predicting contingency management success. So the idea that we might have these dissociable capacities that we should be tailoring things to.
Exactly right. Yeah. And so you actually see that they did a factor analysis of these, and that delayed discounting, attention, and behavioral disinhibition are very distinct factors. And so it's possible that what the intervention that you might use for someone who's not very good at discounting may not be the same one that you would use for someone with inhibitory control issues, which is fascinating to think about. So
but then this comes back to the question of like, what does it mean to be good at discounting?
Right.
So what is a normative, optimal response to like what? I mean, do I want $10 a year from now? No.
No.
So how do you think about what people should be doing in this class?
Also a good question. And I don't know that I have also ever thought about what optimal performance should look like. We've definitely had folks who have done things like they just always pick the delayed reward because it's always more. So you have kind of that straight line across the $10. And we've also had people who are just like, I'm not waiting at all because I'm uncertain about whether I'll get it or not. And they just don't. They always just pick whatever the immediate reward is.
Well,
So.
always $10 is clearly not.
Right.
So this is back to like Tim's question about what adolescents understand or what we tell anybody about the implication or why we would care about this.
Yeah, and I think
I think this is really relevant.
Yeah, I think part of the reason why we actually were giving them money in the beginning was for part of that reason. Like, if it's hypothetical, like I'm always just going to pick, well, you would think whatever the right choices, whatever that choice is. And so, right, exactly. But yeah, I don't know about the validity. I know that there's also a probability discounting task. And so, it's kind of a standard amount, but it's the percentage of your likelihood of getting it. And you see like actually a similar kind of this hyperbolic, it falls off with likelihood. But I feel like sometimes there's an interaction actually in the discounting task with likelihood because you're not absolutely certain if you're going to get it.
I think it's just for us to think about what we're, it's such a powerful and law-like function, but the contextual regulation of it is really.
Mm-hmm.
We have time for one more question?
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I was really interested in the mental health interventions that you're thinking of doing and how a counterfactual intervention like this would be different in something like depression where there is already a lot of counterfactual thinking, like rumination going on,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not necessarily like adaptive.
Right. So we've thought a little bit about it. And the hope is actually, that if we're training them to not do those like the types that lead to rumination, but we teach them actually to do the functional kind that are in service of the goal of not being depressed, that maybe, we can get them to not ruminate because we're going to teach them the kind of the flip side of what to do. I will say one thing that we found out in doing some of the eating studies is that this is not a good intervention for individuals who have eating disorder. So, we had, and it didn't even occur to us until we had a participant say, actually this made me feel really bad. And this was a person who had anorexia. And you can imagine like thinking about a negative food event that you could have made better is probably not really appropriate for someone who probably needs a different kind of treatment for anorexia. So I would not do that for that disorder. And I imagine that there might be other disorders where it probably wouldn't be good.
So let's thank Reese for a wonderful talk.